We think back of what the great works of ancient civilizations in the old world were, the Egyptians, the Romans. We don't recognize that here in North America we had our own counterpart to that, a Native American culture that achieved great public works.
What's unique about Hopewell is the scale at which they did things. This ritual, ceremonial fluorescence was an explosion.
The mysteries persist, hidden beneath the surface and among ancient giant earthworks and mounds. From early explorers in the 1700s to archaeologists today, Ohio's Scioto River Valley remains at the center of unanswered questions. The Native American builders were among the ancestors of today's living tribes. They left an enduring earthen legacy, unlike anything else in the ancient world or today's world. Enormous geometric earthworks were built along the Scioto River and its tributaries, often constructed on a grand scale with an intriguing degree of precision. Many designed as combinations of giant geometric squares, circles, and octagons. Repeated over and over again, the geometry of the past is embedded in river valleys, terraces, and hilltops. Most amazing, the earthworks seem to adhere to a grand architectural design, the earthen signature of a bygone culture. Who were these ancient architects? Early explorers followed rivers that brought them by earthworks, cloaked for centuries by ancient forests. Neither the Shawnee nor other tribes in the Ohio River Valley were actively building earthworks. So it was clear that the mounds and walls were built in the distant past. It wasn't until the relatively recent past that precise mapping and aerial imaging, combined with new technologies, allowed archaeologists to peer into the ground and into the past, uncovering another part of the long-hidden story left by Native Americans. Carbon-14 dating of some of the earliest earthwork features pushed the cultural time clock back to over 2,000 years ago. Ohio's ancient earth architects are known to archaeologists as the Hopewell culture. However, no one knows what these people may have called themselves. With no written language, much of their story remains wrapped in mystery.
There is a long continuity of occupation here throughout the woodland period. Hopewell in this area doesn't represent a migration. Hopewell people are the descendants of Adena people.
The Hopewell culture seems to flourish in southern Ohio around 100 BC, and it's an outgrowth, it seems to be an outgrowth of the previous Adena culture that's there. But by 100 BC in central and southern Ohio, we see these changes, the elaboration of Adena to become something new, something recognizably different, and we call that Hopewell.
Unlike later cultures, there were no towns nor villages. The Hopewell people grew food in small garden plots, supplementing a rich diet from hunting and gathering. They lived in single or extended family compounds scattered throughout Ohio's primeval forests.
Archaeologists have never found more than 3 homes in one place. Where did they form community, these people? Because they must have had a sense of community even though they didn't live in villages. Were these earthworks like surrogate villages? Were they like community centers, like church complexes where people came together for religious and social reasons?
Initially, scholars thought that the Hopewell lived in cities and grew maize, and it would be easy to find these places. But in fact, we know now that they didn't grow maize, and that they didn't live in cities either. They lived in very small settlements, and these places are tricky to find because they're so small on the landscape when compared to these large earthwork centers.
I think the earthworks functioned to bring together, to integrate these scattered populations. So the earthworks were the centers of communities. This was where community was built and maintained over generations.
The Hopewell people made excellent use of the rich environment of central and southern Ohio, enabling them to build the largest, most complex earthworks in North America. Hardwood forests of oak and hickory covered the riverbanks and portions of the floodplain. A few isolated prairies may have existed, kept open by repeated purposeful fires as hunting grounds to attract wildlife. For the native peoples who inhabited this part of Ohio, the Scioto River Valley was the best of all worlds, combining plants and animals found in the forest with those found in the grasslands. With its protective hills and slopes, the Chillicothe area shelters some plants which would normally be found 100 miles further north or south. This mixture of plant communities made this region an ideal place to settle. It was a rich storehouse of natural foods, both plant and animal, while rivers, such as the Scioto and its tributaries, provided additional sources of protein with fish and migratory waterfowl.
These were hunter and gatherers principally and fishers, but they also grew native crops. But the farming was probably supplemental to the hunting and gathering diet. So fundamentally, I think the Hopewell had this wonderful mix. They had the richness of the hunting and gathering diet, but they also had the stability afforded by the little seeds and things of the Eastern agricultural complex, which got them through the long winters and probably also provided the necessary surplus to feed all the people who congregated together at these earthworks for the big ceremonies.
The people of central and southern Ohio had ample food supplies. It took only a small part of each day to get enough food to survive. Because of this, Ohio's native peoples had something that allowed them to leave their mark on the land: time. Though they never attained large population densities, somehow the Hopewell mobilized workforces large enough to move thousands of tons of earth. They displayed an amazing ability to communicate and organize on a massive scale and build mile after mile of embankment walls, moat-like depressions, mounds, and ceremonial passageways flanked by earthen berms.
This is a kind of architecture that's like no other that I've ever had to try to figure out in terms of how are people enclosing space or making meaningful forms that can be perceived readily by the human mind, to be conceptualized by the human mind. And these earthworks are beyond all of the spatial perception tools that I think we moderns possess. They're so difficult to grasp spatially and conceptually.
There's nothing quite like the Hopewell of Southern Ohio. This is where the culture achieved its masterpieces of art and architecture and ceremony. There are manifestations that share many of these characteristics in many parts of Eastern North America, but I don't think there's anywhere else that you would call classic Hopewell.
The culture had several major centers. One was on both sides of the Ohio River at Portsmouth. Today, only a small fraction of that complex of earthworks remains. Another focal point was within the present city of Newark, just east of Columbus. There, the Hopewell constructed several large geometric figures and connected them with miles of parallel embankments. The center of the Hopewell heartland was the Scioto River Valley around Chillicothe. The Hopewell constructed 24 major enclosures in the shapes of squares, circles, and octagons. The Hopewell built other works in the Miami River drainages to the west and into present-day Indiana. Yet their influence reached even farther, eventually spreading across much of North America's eastern woodlands.
With each little settlement maybe only having one extended family, how could they get together to build these enormous places that are miles of earthen embankments and untold numbers of cubic yards of dirt that they'd have to move with digging sticks and baskets, carrying one basket at a time? That's the great enigma that I think draws people to Hopewell. And of course, just the grand scale of these earthwork sites just fires the imagination.
Amazingly, all of this occurred before the introduction of corn and large-scale agriculture, and in a culture that had neither towns nor villages. But they did have ideas, big ideas, and advanced understandings of geometry and astronomy to carry them out. Equally important, the Hopewell had the will and the engineering ability to turn ideas into earthworks, moving earth on a scale never before seen in North America.
It's rare in the world of anthropology to see hunter-gatherer cultures creating public works of this scale, this magnitude, and of this complexity.
The Hopewell monumental architecture is on a scale and of a sophistication that rivals any ancient monuments anywhere else in the world. The Hopewell achievement was unique, and it doesn't owe its iconography and symbolism to any other region of America or the world. It really is a local outgrowth, and this knowledge written on the land is enormously sophisticated, including astronomy and geometry.
I think the nearest comparison to these sites, it's the earth and stone circles of the British Isles. And I think the common factor is that these are societies that are making the transition into agriculture. And so that produces a little bit of a change in settlement patterns and cultural ways and what happens with the sky and the interpretation of the sky, and the kinds of monuments that get built tend to be large and they tend to have to do with larger landscape and so forth.
Agriculture is intimately connected with the rise of the Hopewell. The Eastern Agricultural Complex, this suite of local plants grown by first the Adena, then later the Hopewell, clearly is linked to this fluorescence.
Using wooden digging sticks, stone hoes, freshwater clam shells, and baskets, the Hopewell shaped the earth to their liking. Windows to the past, the earthworks allow us to peer back into their world.
The conditions in which the Hopewell culture flowered allowed the time necessary for large numbers of people to devote themselves to building monumental architecture on a scale that's unprecedented in this part of the world. They clearly weren't devoting a lot of their times to warfare. They weren't worried about conflict that they might encounter. This was, it seems, largely to have been a time of peace.
Hopewell Culture National Historical Park preserves and protects 5 of the most significant sites in the Scioto River Valley drainage. At Sipe Earthworks, a 2-mile-long wall enclosed over 120 acres of what was most likely an immense ceremonial complex. As if designed by a single architect or following unwritten rules of Hopewell architecture, the Sipe complex bears a striking similarity to other earthworks in the region. Like many earthworks, 2 centuries of plowing have flattened the profiles of most walls. But Sipe's steep-sided central mound defied plowing. Archaeologists excavated Sipe Mound in the 1920s and unearthed finely crafted art made of exotic materials, some brought in from distant locations. After excavation, the enormous central mound was completely reconstructed. Hopewell Mound Group is the archaeological type site, the signature earthwork example after which these people are named. Owned by a Chillicothe farmer, Mordecai Hopewell, it was excavated in the 1890s. Though we can be sure the ancient builders did not call themselves Hopewell, any knowledge of their language has been lost to time. Hopewell Mound Group includes the Hopewell's largest single mound, a 500-foot-long ridge that required at least 1.5 million baskets of earth to construct. The complex was ringed by a 2-mile-long wall, creating the largest single earthen enclosure they ever built. A long 6-foot-high section of this ancient wall still exists on the upper terrace. Hopeton Earthworks was constructed about the same time as Mound City across the Scioto River. Hopeton's rounded rectangle had walls 12 feet high and was built adjacent to a circle, a pattern repeated at many Hopewell sites. Though still visible in 1930s aerial photographs, decades of continued plowing reduced Hopeton's impressive walls to barely visible undulations on the landscape. Highback Works contains a circle that is the same size as at 4 other sites. The Highback layout and alignments are strikingly similar to the Newark complex, almost 60 miles to the north. We do know that Mound City was a very special place, even in the midst of the impressive array of earthworks. It is one of the oldest Hopewell earthworks, yet it is also one of the last to be used. Though smaller and less precise in its geometry than other Hopewell sites, Mound City contains a greater concentration of mounds than any other earthwork.
It seems to have a focus to the surrounding landscape. Some of the mounds in the Mound City complex seem to mimic the hills that you see on the landscape when you're sitting at Mound City.
Artifacts discovered at Mound City are a revealing look into the lives of the Hopewell people.
There's virtually no 2 mounds that are alike, no 2 mound centers that are alike. There's a lot of individual variability. That's one of the things, one of the clues that tells us that this wasn't a strongly structured, stratified society. There seems to be a lot of local autonomy.
Before archaeological investigations could salvage some of the Hopewell secrets, looters scavenged mounds and plows pillaged the past. Though much has been destroyed over the years, many of the earthworks were carefully surveyed in the 1840s by 2 amateur archaeologists, Squire and Davis. Ephraim Squire, a newspaperman from New York State, traveled to Ohio to become editor of the Scioto Gazette. Edwin Davis was a medical doctor from Hillsboro, Ohio, who shared a deep fascination with Squire for what they called ancient monuments. Their concern was that these grand but unheralded works of ancient earthen architecture were falling to the farmer's plow, fading furrow by furrow, and being destroyed by the onslaught of American industry and civilization. Squire and Davis set about mapping and describing as many earthworks as they could while there was still time. Their groundbreaking work, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, became the first book ever published by the Smithsonian Institution. Their contributions earned them a vaunted position among the founders of American archaeology, and their maps are still studied by archaeologists to this day. Many Hopewell earthworks share similar dimensions and geometric design features. Each size and shape may have symbolized something specific to the Hopewell and may have been used for separate ceremonial purposes. As grand as each site seems on a human scale, they are still only part of a much, much larger picture that traverses both time and distance.
The motivation must have been incredible. And we're not talking about top-down organization where people are forced to do someone's bidding. I think that they had such an important place in each individual's heart and mind and spirit that they voluntarily built these earthworks. And clearly, there were thousands and thousands of hours involved in building these things. And you don't build these kinds of earthworks without having an enthusiasm behind it. Not much is known, frankly, about the social and the political aspects of Hopewell, but I do know that these earthworks clearly speak to impressive desire to build and to create and to leave something behind that would last for thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years in their view, and that would memorialize their worldview and what they were trying to accomplish, which I think ultimately was this connection to something greater.
In the Scioto River Valley, 5 particular earthwork complexes, including Sipe, share the same design elements and dimensions. A small circle, a large circle, and a square, as if built according to a blueprint from a master architect. The squares follow the same pattern, precisely repeated, with solid clay gate mounds on the side openings, but not at the corner gates. The geometry of the sites may also reflect their use. Archaeologists discovered that burial mounds were always placed in the large circle, never in the small circle or square. When Squire and Davis mapped the squares of these 5 complexes, they discovered that each wall was the same length, and each square enclosed 27 acres. Was there a special underlying significance behind the Hopewell unit of measurement? And if so, what was it? Only in the last few decades have researchers deciphered a part of the underlying repeated patterns of Hopewell architecture, the mathematical and astronomical relationships revealed in the geometry of sculpted earth.
Virtually every Hopewell site that I've looked at has a celestial alignment either to the sun or to the moon, and Mound City is a great example of that. The diagonal axis of Mound City is aligned to the summer solstice sunset. That same diagonal is also the Hopewell measurement unit of 1,054 feet. Is it possible that the Hopewell unit of measurement actually started with a smaller, lesser multiple in the Adena earthworks? And that's certainly the way it's beginning to look from the LiDAR research that I've been conducting. The LiDAR uses near-infrared light, a shot from an aircraft down to the topography. That light is reflected back to the aircraft, and thousands of coordinate points for the underlying topography are recorded. Through vertical exaggeration of those particular coordinate points, we're able to bring out the topography of the earthworks in such a way that has never been seen before.
Squire and Davis, even in the 1840s, they lament the fact that Ohio's earthworks are rapidly disappearing. Only 40 years after Ohio really started to be plowed on a regular basis. Everything written after that, people talk about how it's terrible that these earthworks are disappearing and they're being destroyed right before our eyes, never to be reclaimed. And when I see that, of course, I think, well, sure, you can't see them at the surface, but what's left below surface? The instruments can detect that. So even the flattest farm field can contain all kinds of hidden earthwork treasures that the instruments can detect without any problems.
The great squares and circles did not just stand alone, but followed a common Hopewell pattern of earth architecture. The square nests perfectly inside the great circle. Another standard of measurement applied to smaller circles. The same diameters appeared in several sites, even those separated by many miles. High Bank Works contains a circle the same size as circles at Hopeton, Circleville, Seal, and Newark complexes. Newark Earthworks and High Bank Works are huge complexes sharing an octagonal design and exactly the same size circles, even though they are over 60 miles apart. The precision measurements, repeated architectural use of standardized design elements, the immense amount of human labor required to move uncounted tons of earth, and the social cohesion and organization needed to construct so much on such a grand scale. All of this would rank as an immense achievement for any ancient culture.
What was compelling these people to do all this work? One possibility is religious fervor. They believed in what they were doing for cultural or religious reasons, and when they gathered at these sites, possibly building and labor was part of the ceremony.
Geometry, of course, is a Greek word, and it means to measure the earth. And so I think there's a real poetics about this, that they're using earth to build these giant works of geometry and lay them out on the earth in order, I think, obviously to symbolize the sky. They're talking about the precision of the movement of certain celestial bodies. They're talking about the precision of time. They're talking about the precision of the horizon. They're making abstract order out of certain things that they're pulling from their experience.
Like many early peoples, the Hopewell were sky watchers, and astronomy appears to have played a role in their beliefs. It is impossible to read the minds and gauge the intentions of Hopewell architects. But statistical analysis and reoccurring astronomical alignments at separate sites suggest that many geometric enclosures were used as calendars. The Hopewell paid homage to the sky by moving thousands of tons of earth.
My interpretation of ancient societies in general is that religion is not the way we think of it today. The sense of the sacred probably pervaded everything that they did. And the same is true of astronomy. They certainly didn't practice astronomy the way we do today as a branch of science. Religion and astronomy and agriculture and everyday life and, human relationships, all these things were sort of rolled up together and permeating each other. So the earthworks were probably multifunctional as well. They were for gatherings and festivals and astronomical observations and all the rest of it, but each one of those things was a meaningful permeation into the rest of the life world that these people shared.
At Hopeton, a half-mile-long set of intriguing parallel walls suggests an alignment with the winter solstice sunset. At Hopewell Mound Group, a smaller version of the classic Hopewell Square is oriented toward the winter solstice sunrise. Were these designed, purposeful alignments, or are they happenstance?
The question that's really being addressed is whether or not the alignments that we're finding in the LIDAR data and through archaeoastronomical analyses, whether those alignments are intentional or not. That's what this really comes down to. And the way you assess whether an alignment is intentional is, do you find the alignment repeated at multiple sites? And in the case of Hopewell alignments, we find that that's exactly the case. We find summer solstice alignments repeated at numerous sites. We find winter solstice alignments at numerous sites. So when you find these same alignments recurring over and over again, you begin to build a picture that yes, these alignments are not just random, but rather are intentional.
It's not a big jump to say that the sun and the moon had cultural or religious significance to these people. We can never know maybe what they meant, but among many cultures all over the world, we see this kind of fascination with the movements of the stars, the planets. Wouldn't be unlikely that Hopewell culture had the same feelings and assigned religious significance to those events.
Across many cultures, the winter solstice marked the rebirth of the sun with the promise of spring and longer days to come. Like the solar solstice cycle, but far longer and more complex, The moon has an 18.6-year-long lunar standstill cycle. Some Hopewell complexes appear to have been constructed as astronomical observatories to record, track, or predict lunar standstills. The dates when the moon rises and moon sets are at the northernmost or southernmost points on the horizon. High bank works include an extraordinary octagon with intricate lunar and solar alignments sighted through its many gates. Not surprisingly, the Hopewell architects designed a nearly identical arrangement at the Newark earthworks, far to the north. At Newark, the pattern is tilted counterclockwise exactly 90 degrees, so that the northernmost rising of the moon is sighted through the connection between the circle and the octagon, as seen from a ceremonial observation platform at the top of the circle.
But the real proof to me, and to those of us who went out there in 2005 and 2006 and stood in the avenue that connects the circle with the octagon, the real proof is that we stood out there and we watched the moon rise, as predicted, right where it was supposed to be, right at the time, right on the center axis of this piece of geometry. On a more poetic level, that's the proof.
That lunar standstill cycle is complicated. The moon rises an hour later every day, every night. Sometimes the moon is invisible. It's 18.5 years long, but somebody took the time to watch the very complicated way the moon moves across the sky, and then took the time to design something rather artistic, something to mark the movements of that moon, like a compromise between the science and the art.
The 18.6-year lunar cycle of rises and sets that encompass this long period were recorded in the earthworks at Newark. And the fact that these people understood it well enough to create architecture that incorporated all these alignments indicates that these people were observing the moon very carefully for probably more than a century, probably for centuries, to learn the cycles of the moon, to recognize that pattern, that it was a repeating and a regular pattern, and then to conceive of the fact that you want to construct architecture that brings that celestial choreography down to earth. So it's a magnificent achievement of knowledge, of observation, but then in translating what's in the heavens to earth and architecture is a tremendous creative and architectural achievement.
With so many probable alignments, it appears Newark was intentionally built to record or pay homage to the long lunar cycle. Other Hopewell earthwork sites, as distant as Anderson Mounds in Indiana, also indicate possible solar alignments. In addition to grand geometric earthworks, the Hopewell built fortress-like hilltop enclosures, such as Fort Hill. Impressive high earthen walls have survived the centuries.
In terms of the Hopewell and the major earthworks, we seem to see two kinds. We have these giant geometric complexes that are built in the valleys, and then we have a second kind that we can refer to as the hilltop enclosures, where they pick a flat-topped hill and they enclose the plateau with a wall. Those, because they're up so high, they tended to survive better. When settlers came to this area, they farmed. They cleared the forests of the river valleys and they farmed this area, and these giant geometric earthwork complexes were plowed over. The hilltop enclosures fared differently. Many of them are still beautifully intact. We have Fort Hill, not far from the Chillicothe area, and then we have Fort Ancient, where the walls are still intact and visitors can go there and they can walk along these 2,000-year-old walls.
Fort Hill looms hundreds of feet over the valley floor. Though its moat-like depressions may have held water, they are located inside the walls. The walls are punctuated by numerous gaps, known as gateway openings or gates, making it doubtful that it was ever intended to be a fortification. At Fort Ancient, 20-foot-high walls rise adjacent to bluff tops and extend 3 miles. But like Fort Hill, It may be that these walls were more ceremonial than defensive in nature.
We often find similar kinds of things at hilltop enclosures. Some of them have mounds. In some cases, the mounds cover the places where buildings were, and there are burials and fancy Hopewell artifacts inside those. Of course, for decades, people have thought that they were real forts in the sense of protecting somebody inside them. But one look at a place like Fort Ancient tells you that if these are fort builders, they're not very smart, because there are 84 gateways at Fort Ancient. So if you're trying to protect yourself from somebody outside your fort, why so many gateways? They just seem to enclose space. And that's sort of an enigma. Why are they there? There are very few artifacts to go along with that place. There don't seem to be any geometric enclosures nearby. What is it about that ground that they needed to enclose this space?
In an environment dominated by tall trees, it may be that hilltops represented the best astronomical observatories of all. Archaeologists discovered evidence of complicated site preparation and construction methods. At Hopeton, there is evidence that earthwork construction started with the removal of all topsoil from the construction site to create a stable foundation of clay subsoil. Cross-sections of walls and mounds show layers of different materials. Clay and sand layers were often alternated. In many cases, walls and mounds are much more than heaps of dirt. They are carefully engineered.
We know that they use different colored soils. Some of the squares, for example, are red soil. The interior of the Great Circle at Newark was a kind of a yellowish clay that was applied to the surface. There was something important about getting different colored soils into these earthworks.
At Sipe, burial mounds were capped with a layer of limestone gravel mixed with water, clay, and sand that hardened into light gray Hopewell concrete, protecting the mounds from erosion. Perhaps the most elusive question is why? Why did these people invest so much time and energy in constructing such impressive earthworks? We know that these complexes were not walled villages. There is little evidence that anyone lived in them. If anything, sections of the complexes may have been more like plazas, churches, observatories, or cemeteries. They appear to have been destinations or gathering places. Like Jerusalem or Mecca in the Middle East, the earthworks may have drawn travelers from great distances for spiritual pilgrimages. Because of astronomical alignments, we know that certain sites tracked movements of the sun or the moon. One speculation is that ceremonies might be timed to such alignments, and that the sky was an integral part of their religion or their view of the world. Certainly, these places were meant to be seen. Like skyscrapers or dramatic public buildings today, the earthworks were monuments. As open areas, they were beacons in the dark, almost unending canopy of old-growth forest. Highly reflective on moonlit nights and dazzling in sunlight, the earthworks made a statement. These were important places. Like the great cathedrals of Europe, they may have been created to convey religious inspiration. Gothic architects built cathedrals ever higher, but Hopewell architects and engineers built out, enclosing phenomenal acreages. No matter what the original purpose, the huge geometric enclosures must have inspired awe then, as they do now. What would it have been like to go back in time and paddle the Scioto River 2,000 years ago, passing one great earthwork after another along the way? What would it have been like to visit one of these immense sacred sites and attend a religious ceremony during the golden age of the Hopewell culture?
We would have almost no idea about what the Hopewell people wore as clothing, except for the few representations on figurines, if it were not for the remarkable preservation in the mounds of textile fragments preserved by the copper salts of some of the large copper plates and other ornaments that they wore as part of their ceremonial lives. And these textiles tell us that they had a rich cultural environment. They wore finely woven clothes. They're not using a loom, but they're creating really elaborate textiles, colored textiles, incorporating rabbit fur and feathers, wearing their fine woven clothing and all the decorations that must have been a part of that in these ritual settings. And we only get a tiny glimpse of that through the fragments that have been preserved in the archaeological record.
The Hopewell people left much more than earthworks. Beneath the surface of the mounds are links to the past. Copper from the southern shore of Lake Superior. Silver from east central Canada. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region of Wyoming. Mica from the Blue Ridge Mountains. And from the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, shells. It would seem that Hopewell trade and influence extended across the eastern half of North America. But trade alone may not have accounted for all of the exotic materials found in the archaeological record. Instead of trading for obsidian, metals, or shells, the Hopewell may have conducted expeditions to distant lands to get what they valued.
People have always been mystified by the fact that there are enormous quantities of this exotic material coming into Ohio, but very little Ohio material going in the opposite direction.
It looks like much more of a one-way pattern of acquisition. The mica, marine shell, copper, all these things from distant lands. It looks much more likely that Ohio people went out, gathered those materials, and brought them back directly.
Pilgrims to sacred sites may have also brought trade goods or gifts of exotic materials from far away.
The attraction in Ohio was the Hopewell ceremonial centers, drawing people from hundreds of miles away perhaps, who were bringing offerings of this exotic raw material. And what they took away was not any commodity in a trade network, but that special dynamic experience of having participated in these rituals, perhaps even in the construction of the earthworks. That's what they took away with them, that inspiration.
The Hopewell were skilled artisans, replicating the natural world in everyday objects, such as pottery, and for ceremonial uses, such as smoking pipes. Elaborate designs were cut into pounded plates of copper. Mica was worked by artisans into exquisite, delicate shapes.
The iconography of Hopewell art, of course, includes the animals and the representations from nature, but there's also a very interesting geometry and almost an abstract sensibility to some of the art there that I'm sure is a reflection of some of their cosmological principles, some of their religious beliefs. Every bit as evocative as the Christian cross or the Islamic crescent or the Star of David, but symbols that we don't have the meaning to necessarily, but that's the richness of the iconography of the Hopewell art.
It seems like many of these Hopewell objects and the ceremonies that they were used in were associated with honoring the ancestors and with communicating with the spirit world, communicating with the animal world and the spiritual forces around them, ensuring the renewal of the earth with the continuation of the seasons.
You'd think this was the product of a civilization where you had specialty of labor, a division of labor within the society, where there were people who were artists their whole lives and made their living through art. It's so well done. And yet, we can't imagine such a thing being possible in a hunter-gatherer, gardener society living in these scattered hamlets throughout the forest. Something was driving these people to do exceptional artistic work.
One of the most intriguing mysteries is, why did it end? what happened? By 400 AD in Europe, the Roman Empire was weakening, and so too was the Hopewell culture in eastern North America. The art and craftsmanship seen in Hopewell artifacts diminished, and their influence across the East contracted. By 500 AD, the Hopewell culture lasted some 700 years, but mounds and earthworks were no longer being built.
This was, it seems, largely to have been a time of peace. And the fact that corresponding to the end of all of that is a time when you do see walled villages, you do see people buried with arrows lodged in their ribs, suggests that that might have contributed to the end of Hopewell, to the end of this architecture and ritual that required enormous amounts of cooperation. When it all falls apart is when that cooperation breaks down and you have conflict. You have people competing over farmland or deer or other kinds of resources. And perhaps fundamentally it might relate to population levels rising to the point where these local areas couldn't sustain the small dispersed communities when they came together for more intensive food production and then had to defend what they were growing.
We see people gathering in villages toward the end of the Hopewell culture, so did they feel unsafe? Was it a time of turmoil? Drawing people to live together for the sake of safety. Well, if you have a lot of people living together for safety reasons, you have to feed them, and that's hard to do on a hunter-gatherer diet. So you have to be able to rely on crops to feed that many people. Well, ironically, farmers, they can feed more people, they can have higher population density, but they have less free time than hunter-gatherers do. Maybe there wasn't enough time for them to build these anymore, or now that they have villages, they didn't need gathering places like they did before they were living in villages.
Were they displaced by marauding enemies? Or did they migrate to a distant part of the country? There are many theories, but the mysteries surrounding the ancient architects remain.
There are so many unanswered questions about the Hopewell. Where'd they go? Why did they stop building earthworks? It seems based on physical evidence, skeletal evidence. They didn't go anywhere. They were still there. They just stopped building earthworks. They may not have stopped going to the earthworks, and they may have fiddled around with modifying them a little bit, in generations later. But by and large, there were no large geometric earthworks built after about 400 AD.
When the Roman Empire fell, the Romans did not die off or move away. Most likely, the Hopewell also remained. But now, like the Romans, they changed the way they did things. They did not just disappear, and their descendants walk among us today. For many tribes, these are sacred sites. Sadly, we have lost most traces of this intriguing story. 90% of the picture has been destroyed by farming, looting, and the constant expansion of our highways and cities. Earthworks that had survived for over 2,000 years have been virtually eliminated within the last 150 years. Hopewell Culture National Historical Park is a vital piece in the jigsaw puzzle of our past, protecting and preserving key remnants of this once vibrant culture. We may never know all the answers to the many mysteries the Hopewell left behind. Yet here, we find a tantalizing glimpse into a lifestyle that influenced developments across the eastern half of the continent. A way of life that resulted in monuments of earth that challenged the imagination. That is why Hopewell Culture National Historical Park and other remaining sites deserve protection. These places are the remaining tangible links with the past residents of this land. The fog of time and mystery remain, but places like these help us see a little more clearly into the past. and into the lives of these ancient architects.